to look at Luke's Gospel. So we're going to look at two passages in particular in Luke's Gospel. So if you have a Bible, if you've been given a Bible, could you put it in front of you, please? Or maybe you've brought one with you. However, if you have a smartphone, I'm about to put up a QR code for you. I have to say, I think, John, thank you for your introduction. I think my children would think the idea that I do anything in the 21st century, they would think is not at all the case. However, I have created a QR code. This is just amazing to me, and I did it without having to phone up any of my family to ask them how to do it. So if you have a smartphone, get your smartphone out, and this will take you to Luke chapters 1 and 2, which is what we're going to be looking at. And in a moment, I'll put the QR code up for Luke chapter 24. It works as well, doesn't it? I know, it makes me so happy. So that's Luke chapters 1 and 2 and Luke chapter 24, although you might be able to navigate just from one QR code. If you have a Bible, page 1061 in these versions, if you put one finger into that and then one finger in sort of 1025, and we'll be flipping between the two a bit. The angle might not be right. Okay, so Luke chapters 1 and 2 and Luke chapter 24. Chapters 1 and 2, these are the birth stories. So we're back at Christmas, as it were. And Luke chapter 24 we heard read, sorry about the very long reading, but we heard most of Luke chapter 24 read to us just now, the resurrection stories according to Luke. So the chapters of the from the birth stories and the resurrection stories, the stories that are in both of those are what Luke chooses to tell us. Virtually all of this is distinct to Luke. So he's made a decision that he wants to tell us about the stories that he tells us about, the birth stories and the different resurrection stories. Oh look, the Bible's appearing as I speak. So you're going to have to find the pages and look at the screen all at the same time. So it's 1061 and 1025 if you're given a Bible. So I want to suggest to you this morning that there are reflections of what Luke tells us in the birth stories to be found in the resurrection stories. So I want us today to picture Luke as a person, as a writer. Now he's there to tell us the things of God, and he's there, I was going to say under the influence of God. I mean, maybe you understand what I mean by that. But he's also a writer. He's making decisions. You know, we learned some time ago that he's a historian. He's looking at his sources. He's making choices as to what to tell us. And the choices he makes are because they tell us particular things. And I think that there is some evidence that he's looking at the resurrection stories that he chooses to give us are showing that the birth stories are being fulfilled. So things that he told us about in the birth stories are coming about in the resurrection. So two particular events then that we're concentrating on today. First of all, a long word, incarnation. What this means is when God came to this earth. So the birth stories, when Jesus Christ was born. So when God became part of our own human story. And the resurrection, which in a sense is God coming back to this earth because he's obviously left it following the crucifixion. So the incarnation, Luke chapters 1 and 2, and the resurrection, Luke chapter 24. So several ways in which there are similarities between these stories. I'm going to have to flip through these stories quite quickly. If you've got a Bible, you might sort of keep up, or maybe when you go home, you want to sort of look back at these stories and consider some of these similarities. Luke tells us that before Jesus was born, Zachariah was told, he was an old man, he was told that his wife, who was also old, called Elisabeth, would have a child, and that child would grow up and would be John the Baptist. Zachariah did not believe the angel when he was told that. There was disbelief, such disbelief, that he then couldn't speak for the next 9+ months. Similarly, in the passage that we've just had here, that extraordinary line, the women, they go, they see the empty tomb, they're told that Christ has risen, they go back to his disciples and tell them, and they do not believe them. They thought their words were like idle chatter. They thought they were as nonsense. At the heart of the incarnation, at the heart of the time when Jesus first came to this earth, and at the heart of the resurrection, there is doubt, there is disbelief, there is an incredulity that says this cannot be, despite all the teaching of the Old Testament and despite all the teaching of Jesus himself. People did not believe. And maybe we can take heart from that, because I suspect, if we're honest, there are times when we think, really? Can this be? What on earth is meant by this? At the very heart of these two absolutely crucial events, there is disbelief. They were wrong to disbelieve, but they did disbelieve at that time. Secondly, in the birth stories and the resurrection stories, there are angels. Luke tells us that there are angels. We've seen one angel came to Zachariah, another angel came to Mary and said, you will be the mother of Jesus. And then, do you remember all the angels that appeared to the shepherds and said that Jesus has been born, and this is how you're going to find him? A great host of angels singing praises to God and offering peace to humankind. So angels are there, and angels are there in Luke 24. They're not called angels, but there are two men in shining white, and most importantly, they're bringing a message from God to humans. So I think in most terminology, we would call those angels. Angels are there to tell the people and to tell us of Jesus. Jesus has been born. The Messiah is here. Go and find him. And the opposite, Jesus is risen, he is not here. You're looking in the wrong place. A message from God to the people of the time and to us today. An interesting, I'm not sure what this teaches us, but just an interesting comparison, that clothes are important. So when the angels said to the shepherds, go and find the Messiah, they said, you will find him wrapped in swaddling bands, and most importantly, lying in a manger. So what the child will be wearing is evidence of who he is. And similarly, when the tomb is empty, except for the linen cloths, so they're there. The clothing that Jesus had been wrapped in are still there. So this is a sort of something different has happened to the body, because if somebody just moved the body, they would have picked up body and linen cloths all in one bundle, as it were. So there's clothing is used by the angels in both stories as evidence for who Jesus is. And then, this is slightly more complicated. After Jesus was born, he was taken, as was the custom, to the temple by Mary and Joseph. When they got there, they met two very elderly people, one person called Anna and another person called Simeon. Simeon was the person who'd been told by God that he would not die before he had seen the Messiah. And as Mary and Joseph walked in with this tiny baby, just a few days old, he was given the wisdom to recognize that that baby was indeed the Messiah. And he said words to Mary that are very, very profound and must have had a big impact on her and are important to us today. He said two things. He said that Jesus it was the means by which Judaism and Israel would be redeemed, if that was their choice, but also that Jesus came as a light to be revealed to the whole world, so that he was there for the Gentiles and for the Jews. And we can see that reflected in what is said on that road to Emmaus. So the story where the couple are sort of wandering back home, distraught because Jesus had died, and he comes alongside them, and they don't recognise him at that point. And they say to him, "We had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. In other words, we had hoped that those words that Simeon had said 33 years previously, that he would come to redeem Israel, we had hoped that he was, but it was in the past tense, because for them it was all over at that point. But also, not only to redeem Israel, also repentance for all nations, so that Jesus isn't just there for the Jews, he's also there for all people. So 4 ways in which there is a reflection of what Luke tells us in the birth stories, in what he tells us of the resurrection stories as well. Possibly what he was doing was to say, look at what was promised in the incarnation, look what was promised in that this was the Messiah coming. Now look at the resurrection, and all of those things at this point have come true. So, next thing that I'd like us to do is to take 2 of those stories, one from the birth story, one from the resurrection stories that Luke has given us, and to look at them in just a bit more detail and to see how they link up. So, the first story in the birth stories, so this is Luke chapter 2, towards the end of Luke chapter 2. We read the story. This is the only thing we've got in the Bible about Jesus as a young person. We've got the birth stories and we've got him as an adult, and just this one little story about him as a 12-year-old. And what happens is that Mary and Joseph, with Jesus and probably lots of other people from their village, set out. They go to Jerusalem and then they come back again. And we'll find out why they went in just a minute. But on their way back, they realise that Jesus isn't with them. So then they have to go back to Jerusalem to find him, and then all the way back to Nazareth again. So that's just a little story about Jesus as a 12-year-old. And I want to compare that with you with the story of this really important resurrection story that Luke gives us of this couple going to Emmaus, whereby they're walking home, Jesus appears with them, he tells them about things in the Old Testament, and they sort of begin to understand something, but it's not until they get home and he breaks the bread that they actually recognise him. So we're just going to spend a minute or two seeing, is Luke not only saying, look at the birth stories, they have been fulfilled in the resurrection stories, but actually if we look at these 2 little stories that only Luke tells us, that there are lots of similarities between them and telling us a fair bit about Jesus. So, first of all, both of these stories happen in the context of a Passover celebration. So Mary and Joseph, Jesus, and the villagers, they're all going up to Jerusalem to take part in the Passover celebration. And we know that the people who are going back to Emmaus have been taking part in a Passover celebration, because almost certainly the Last Supper that Jesus had celebrated with his disciples just 4 days earlier, almost certainly that was a Passover celebration. So both of these stories are set within the context, a Jewish context, of the Passover having been celebrated. Secondly, they both require a backwards and a forwards in terms of travelling. So for Mary and Joseph, they left Nazareth, they went to Jerusalem, and then they went back again, except on their way back, they realised Jesus wasn't with them, so then they go back to Jerusalem, find Jesus, and then all the way back to Nazareth. Backwards and forwards they had to go. For the people in Emmaus, they'd left Jerusalem in the late afternoon, got back in the evening, so they got back, they realised what had happened, so instead of going to bed, they then were so excited, wanted to share their news, so they go all the way back to Jerusalem again, and then presumably go back to Emmaus, I don't know. We're talking sort of 10 kilometres, something like that, and all of this would have been walking. So this is not insignificant, this sort of walking backwards and forwards. So both stories have got a context of the big celebration, but also all this sort of trekking backwards and forwards. Thirdly, in both stories we have traumatised couples. So Mary and Joseph, they travel to Jerusalem, they come home, and then they realise Jesus isn't with them. And then they have to go back to Jerusalem in order to find him. I said in the previous service that many, many years ago now, Chris and I were shopping in Sainsbury's with our first child, who was about 2.5 at the time, and we lost him. I think I probably assumed he was with Chris, and Chris assumed he was with me. And we realised that he wasn't with either of us. I gather prime ministers have had similar problems, but other than that, there's not a lot of similarity. 2.5 minutes, I think, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, that sort of time, we lost him. That time, it felt like 10 years. Where was he? Where was he? And all those pictures go through your head, don't you, as to where he is, and should somebody be looking for him? Should we stand by the door to stop anybody taking him away? And actually, he was just sitting by the baked beans or something, and having a whale of a time. And Mary and Joseph, they had a long time of this. Absolutely traumatic, I think this must have been for them. And then similarly, this couple going to Emmaus, they were followers of Jesus. They had signed up to Jesus. They thought that he was the one to redeem Israel. And then 2-3 days previously, they'd watched him being crucified. It was all over. All that band of followers, all gone. What was the point? Why were you going to stay together? Indeed, there's some fear there probably, because the Romans, you get rid of the leader, and then you might go after the followers as well. So there's an issue there. So they are wandering home, sad and distracted. They don't understand. We put our faith in this person, and he's dead. And then confusion, because they knew that the women had said he wasn't in the grave and had risen. And they thought, this just makes it even worse. No, I thought this had happened. I'm beginning to get my head round it. And then, blow me, they come down and say, actually, he's not here, he's risen. So they were just going home. You could just imagine, can't you, the despondency, the slowness of walk, probably. So Mary and Joseph, confused and worried. People going back to Emmaus, sad and distracted. This is such an obvious comparison, and yet I've got to my great age and have only just seen it. Jesus was lost in the temple for 3 days. 3 days. I mean, just picture for a moment Mary and Joseph. 3 days, and they don't know where Jesus is. But 3 days, in the back of your head, 3 days, 3 days, 3 days. This matters. This is a number that matters. And similarly, for the people on the road to Emmaus, this is sort of opening this up. Jesus had been absent on this earth for 3 days. On the Friday, he'd been crucified, and they were talking on the Sunday evening. So Jesus was gone, as it were, from Mary and Joseph for 3 days, and he was gone from the people walking back to Emmaus, and indeed all of his disciples, for 3 days. And lastly, when Mary and Joseph found Jesus in the temple talking to the religious leaders and said, well, I'd like to know exactly what they said to him, but we probably haven't got that recorded. He said to them, "Didn't you know it was necessary for me to be in my Father's house? It was necessary. I had to be here." I wonder what he meant by that. Now, as he was moving from being a child to being an adult, did he have to spend time reminding himself, renewing that relationship with God, the relationship that had changed in the sense that he was now on this earth and not in the same way in heaven with God? It was necessary. If I was Mary and Joseph, I think I might have said, and wasn't it necessary to tell me that you needed to be in the temple for 3 days? But they were good people, better parents than I've been. And on the road to Emmaus, Jesus said to them, although they didn't know it was Jesus, "Was it not necessary for the Messiah to suffer these things?" It was necessary. And Luke drops in this phrase every now and then, usually to do with Jesus' death. It is necessary. It's not something that's an accident. This is something that's planned. This is something that is supposed to happen. It is necessary. It's there to do a job. And Jesus has to see it through. But they'd forgotten that. So 5 ways in which these little stories that Luke the historian, the only person to tell us of these particular incidents, which tell us so much about Jesus and his work and the way in which people interacted with him after in the time of the resurrection. He put those in there, and I wonder when he added the story of the road to Emmaus? Was he thinking, this is showing that the things that Jesus talked about when he was 12, so he was gone for 3 days. He was with his Father for 3 days. It was necessary for that to happen. The Passover is somehow important, as we looked at a couple of weeks ago. And all of that becomes blatantly obvious on the road to Emmaus. The 3 days, the Passover, the fact Jesus hadn't been there, the fact that he is now recognised. And just to leave you with a couple more thoughts, just honing in on Emmaus. So if we've looked at the birth stories and resurrection in general, we've looked at being lost in the temple and the Emmaus road in particular. Now just to hone in on this story of the road of Jesus meeting the couple on the road to Emmaus. I want to suggest to you that it is two things apparently contradictory at the same time. That first of all, it's a unique one-off event. That this is a resurrection appearance that happened at the time in order that people could understand things about Jesus. That it happens on the first day of the week, so on the Sunday, the beginning of the week, and that in the breaking of the bread, that was a meal that was shared. And this is a sort of new way of sustenance. This is a new creation, a new beginning. Jesus is back. This is a different way from the way that we see him. He's come back as a person, able to eat fish, as he will eat fish a little bit later on in Luke's Gospel. A new creation, a new way of doing things, a new way of following him, a new being, and on the first day of the week, but a one-off. This happened. He's a historian. This is an event. He's written it down for us to learn from it. But it's more than that, because it's also an ongoing moment. The disciples, those two disciples walking to Emmaus, they recognized Jesus in two ways. They first of all recognized him as he revealed the scriptures to them. Now, they didn't quite see who he was. Their hearts burned within them. So they were getting the gist of it. They were getting to understand, even though they couldn't actually say, oh, you're Jesus. But the fresh explanation of the scriptures meant that they were able to begin to see who Jesus was. And that's how Emmaus is not just a one-off event. It's something that happens for Christians down the ages, and it happens to us today. As we open the scriptures, as we read them in a different way, as we look at paintings, we listen to music, we listen to people talking about them, we learn different ways of Jesus. It's an ongoing thing. Jesus rose, and the people going to Emmaus saw him, but it's ongoing for us in the same way as the scriptures are explained to us. And then, of course, the way they actually recognised him, they talked to him for, how long must it have been? A couple of hours maybe. They'd had a meal with him, and they talked with him there. And then he took the bread, and he blessed it, and he broke it, and in that moment, they knew who Jesus was. And that was a one-off. You know, that's something that happened that is recorded for us to learn from and to place our belief in. But we know it's ongoing, don't we? For every time we share a meal with fellow believers, every time we come here and share in communion, then Emmaus is happening over and over again. For in that moment, we recognise that Jesus wasn't just raised all those years ago on that one-off Emmaus road, but he is raised over and over and over again as we live our lives, as we follow him, and as we work together to understand the scriptures and to meet him in the breaking of the bread. So we're going to turn to our prayers now.